So, okay. So as Amber mentioned, my name is Luke Tomzuk, and I am sorry, I am a community autism peer specialist, uh, and I work for Community Behavioral Health and Temple University. Um, so I came up with this title with the theme in mind, developing the peer interventionist, how one role lifts community voices. Um, and I did so because as I sat down and thought about this, I just thought that the community autism peer specialist is the quintessential role in lifting community voices. Um, because we're out there in the community, we support people on the spectrum just like us who are going through similar experiences as us at that particular point in time. And yeah, so and it was a process between the different teams at Temple University and CBH, and I felt like this was a very appropriate title for what I wanted to talk about. So I just wanted to mention that. Um, so um, Before we get too far into it, I want to give a quick breakdown of what I'll be talking about today. So in the first portion, I'll go over an introduction, and it will be pretty comprehensive. But I think it's really important to understand like some of the contextual background of where I've been, where I've been in my life, some of the struggles that I've had, and then in the next part, I'm going to talk about my early work career, and then following that, I'll talk about my role with Temple University before I joined community behavioral health, which is what I'll be talking about after that. And then the last thing I'll talk about today is how the whole world changed after the coronavirus outbreak took a hold on the region. So before we get too far into it, though, I want to, like I said, go over the introduction, a little bit of background. So I was born on May 21st, 1996, and I developed normally until about the age of, or I should say about 18 months old. And that's when my parents started to notice some changes in myself that weren't great ones. And what I mean by that is like, I did have some muscle weakness, but the more troubling signs were that like I wasn't responding to communication from others. I was flapping hands and as well as pacing. But the lack of communication, lack of response when someone called my name was something that my parents were most concerned about. So we went to a developmental pediatrician, and at 2 years old, I was diagnosed with post-developmental delays. It did take a little bit of time, but 6 months later, they noticed that that my progression wasn't. I was still going on a decline as far as my progression, um, and they felt like I needed more help. So they went back to the developmental pediatrician and said that I had moderate mental retardation, and obviously that word is not it's not used like it's not a great word to use. It has a lot of negative connotation. We should stop using it. Um, so, um, so at the same time, though, my mom was also studying to become a teacher, and she felt like something was off. So she did some research, and she had to do the research to figure out that I was on the autism spectrum, and I mean it sort of just hit on her that like that I have autism spectrum disorder. So the reason why the diagnosis didn't come until so late, and it didn't come at 2 years, was because at that time pediatricians wanted people to be parents to be eased into the diagnosis. They didn't want like they didn't want people to feel all that upset about a diagnosis, but we were pretty we weren't that happy because we thought it hindered progress towards curbing some of the symptoms I was experiencing, such as nonverbal communication, and a really troubling one, which was selective in my diet, and that obviously is a major threat to your health. Um, so with all that in mind, uh, my parents used the Temple's Institute on Disabilities, um, and they were really helpful in my mom going to Harrisburg and fighting for the services that I needed. So so eventually we were able to receive applied behavioral analysis services at the home. Um, and again, most of them took place at home. The feeding therapy to treat some of the to treat the selectivity in my diet that did take place at Children's Hospital Philadelphia. It was roughly 20 years ago. Um, so so yeah, and those weren't the only services I received. I did also receive some some excuse me. Um, I did receive music therapy and things like that. Um, yeah, so I just felt like ABA has really gotten me to where I am today, but I want to caution everyone that it's not true for everybody. Just because ABA was really successful and we were able to do it at the home doesn't mean that uh, doesn't mean that it's going to work for you or your child. Um, we heard earlier in the conference about children that were diagnosed later than me, or even parents that were diagnosed at the same time as their children. So um, I just want to caution everyone that ABA is something that you really need to think long and hard about. Um, if you feel like uh, different treatments are going to work better, then I definitely recommend that you utilize those treatments. Um, so um, I will say that the services did not end after my early years of diagnosis. I did make progression, and I like to say that I could sing before I could talk, because coming that because I mean that was the truth. I would sing in like the bathtub or in the shower um, before before I really started to communicate. It's just we knew that my communication was there. We just needed to figure out a way to find it. Um, so now I'll get into a little bit about elementary school. Um, so between kindergarten and 12th grade, I went to the Philadelphia Academy Charter School, which is located in the far northeast. The elementary and middle school buildings they're the same building, and the high school was right around the corner, basically. So I will say that the first year of school was the most challenging for me because in the first year, that was really when that was the first time I interacted with anybody my own age other than my siblings, and that was a challenge for me. But between that kindergarten and second grade, I had an aide in the classroom with me, and that did prove to be beneficial. But once second grade turned into third grade, it was determined I no longer needed a therapist in the room with me. Um, so and that was challenging for me. They said I made enough progress to not have an aide, but I wasn't quite sure what that meant. Um, and going into third grade, I really I really turned into, like, not being able to uh, when I turned into third grade, that's when I really started to get into it on my own, without an aide, without my parents there to support me in the classroom or anywhere else. So that was definitely a big transition for me. Um, but one way I tried to remedy that situation is because I tried to remedy it because uh, I wanted to get more involved in my, like, get more involved, meet more people, things like that. And one way I did that was through one of the services I received, which was occupational therapy. So the classroom had an occupational therapist, um, and or the occupational therapist at a classroom, excuse me. And so I would go in there about once a week, and I'd have lunch, and eventually I would start taking a friend to lunch. And excuse me, that was a really great thing because oftentimes uh, those friends that I would take were not on the spectrum. Um, and it wasn't that I didn't notice that there were other people on the spectrum around me, even at that early age. Um, it was more like I wanted to get to know more of a wide variety of people. Crazy that I came to these realizations at such a young age. Um, so, but yeah, the weekly lunch in the OT room was highly successful, and and I also started getting involved in school plays. So, second, third, and fourth grade, I wasn't quite at that level where I was getting big parts or anything like that. But that really changed once I got into middle school. Um, so middle school was definitely among the times when like that I'm going to be talking about right now, among the best. Because there was a transition around third grade in which the friend that I would see at the friend that I would see in the lunchroom, um, or in the occupational therapy room, it changed because he moved to the suburbs, and that was a very challenging transition for me. Um, so uh, so yeah, it was very challenging, and it took me a while to find another friend, but eventually I did find another friend, and it proved to be really great experience because with each passing week we got closer and closer, and he included me in his he included me in his he included me in his friend group, and that made me feel included as a whole. So so yeah, um and I continued to be involved in the plays. So in fifth grade I was JoJo and Susical, and my mom still remembers uh, a song that I sung, and she still like sheds a tear when she thinks about it. It's called "I Alone in the Universe." If you've heard of Susical, you've heard of it. It's definitely a powerful song. So um, in sixth grade, if anyone knows Once Upon a Mattress, I was Prince Dauntless. Um, in seventh grade, I was in Beauty and the Beast, and I played Lumiere. Um, and then lastly, uh, in eighth grade, I was Captain Shang in Mulan. Um, so I was getting pretty big parts, and people knew who I was because of these shows. Like, but the shows were really important because my siblings were in sports, and like every week, a lot of weekends there would be a big game, almost the entire year. But for me, this was my one big weekend that I could feel like them. So that was really important to me. Um, and it was really important that I had the support and guidance of my directors as well. So I should note that in elementary and middle school, there were a combination of kind and unkind kids. And I mentioned about my friend group earlier. They did run for the student council, and they were running for several different offices. And I didn't um, I didn't join up with them because I think it's wrong to just monopolize an organization like that with friends who think the same way that you do. So I separated myself from that situation, but I still was a part of the friend group. In fact, I ended up voting against the friend group. Um, so uh, and I also ran in seventh grade, by the way, and lost, and that could have played a role as well in my decision. I won't mince words with that. And by the way, I was still in middle school. I was still receiving some speech therapy, and this is when I started to gain extra time on tests because that was another issue that I experienced. But the issues only amplified in high school. So the friend group that I mentioned after 8th grade hit, they moved to so my one friend that I went to the OT lunches with, he he was unlike my other friend in that he lived in the suburbs, and there's a rule, at least at that time, that you could stay at your school in the suburbs, or no, I have that flipped. You can stay at the Philadelphia Academy Charter High School to go to high school, but this particular individual is not like that. He wanted to. I feel strongly that he wanted to go back to his hometown and go to high school there. And I understand completely. It was just that transition. That was something that took a long time for me to recover from. Um, and it caused me to not have to isolate myself. I felt very alone, and there were days even in senior year where I would go entire days without interacting with anybody, and that was a really depressing feeling because like literally I would leave my house around like 7:30 sometimes, or about 7, and that'd be the last time I talked to anybody until I got home, about sometimes 4:35 or even 6 o'clock, which that was really challenging. I would have appreciated if more people would sit with me at lunch, and I could interact with more people. That's not to say that didn't happen a few times. It's more like it didn't happen enough. Um, but one thing that didn't change was the fact that I stayed involved, and I did remain a presence around a lot of people. So yeah, um, I went I yeah, so I went to or I did the drama club. With the drama club, I was involved all 4 years. I was the only person to have performed in all 4 shows in the drama club. That's pretty significant because the very next year I was in or the high school cut their drama club and they merged with the shows that I did earlier in my career. So I definitely find that to be significant, and I was also the vice president of that organization. I was also involved in some other groups for a short amount of time, like the National Honor Society. I was involved with that for 2 years, and I was the treasurer of that organization. I um, I was involved in the Model UN for a year, and I got to go downtown to a conference that's considered one of the most prestigious conferences. It's called the Ivy League Model United Nations Conference, or IOMUNC. That's how they called it. It was run by Penn. Um, and and then I was also involved for a short time in the music club, and I did have a chance to perform at a couple school events in my senior year. But the thing that really amplified what was going on with me, and was when I ran for student council. I had been involved during my sophomore year, and I ran during my junior year, but didn't win. But in my senior year, I ran for president, and I won with 61% of the vote. Um, Rather high because there were two other candidates running against me. But I ran into the same problem. A lot of the candidates were a part of this clique group organization, like your classic Mean Girls type of clique, and I don't think they were too pleased that their presidential candidate was defeated. So that's when I started to realize that this isolation couldn't last much longer. I was often treated unkind in high school, and that all, and you would think that when I won the election by a large margin, that might change. but in fact that didn't, and only got worse. And it was only made worse by the teacher that ran the student council. So like whenever something would go wrong, she would talk to the three people of the friend group that won and had seats, and she would talk, like, she would let them know what the problem was and like what the remedy was. Try to come up with a remedy, I should say. And but like whenever she would try to talk to me, I was alone by myself. There are very rare cases that wasn't the case. It was often they were separated from me, and I was the only one uh, left standing. So it was. I mean, going back on that, I wish it hadn't happened that way. Like, I definitely feel like it happened because I wasn't great at advocating for myself at this time. Like, I almost told the teacher how I felt, because I was going at that point I was going through a coming of age moment, but it didn't quite materialize. I was too nervous to speak up and speak out about what was going on. Except at this, I started going at the end of my junior year to the support group meeting, and there wasn't a name for the group, but it was a support group filled with people on the spectrum. And by the way, at this time, most of my friends were on the spectrum, and a large part of it was due to this group. Um, and that's when I realized that I needed groups like this to continue and talk about how I was feeling. So that's when college comes in. And one of the first things that I did was I became involved in a support group called Social Exchanges, which is they meet in a room usually, and then they go out into either the Temple University campus or downtown, and they do something in the community. So that was an added aspect. Now that I think about it, an added aspect of social exchanges that was non-existent in the other group that I was a part of. So I joined in my freshman year, and I stayed on all 4 years, and then I recently rejoined the group. And I'll talk a little bit about why I rejoined the group in a little bit later in the presentation. Another problem I was facing. Don't forget, I was coming off the heels of the horrible time I had in high school. Was that I had no interest in living in a dorm, because I thought the same thing would happen at a dorm that happened in high school. So I had my mind set on commuting from home, but then my brother at the time, he was living at an apartment called the Newman Center Apartments. It was run by a Catholic organization that's located on Broad Street on campus, and they basically serve it's like a church for people that see it as an important part of their life. So while they're away from home, obviously. So a spot opened up in their apartments, and it just happened to be a spot that was the same apartment as my brother had lived in for the previous few months. So I jumped at the opportunity, and I lived off campus with my brother. So I only lived with him for 1 year because he ended up graduating at the end of that year. But I stayed on with the Newman Center Apartments throughout my 4 years, and I can say, although I am a little bit different from that community, I do appreciate what they did for me, and they definitely made me feel included in their community. So and then I'll say this too. Some of my friends were on the spectrum, and some of them were not. And a large part of why that was the case was the start of my early professional career with student center operations, or SEO as we like to call it. So I worked for SEO between fall 2016 and summer 2019. They let me stay on, and after I graduated, and I'll get into why that was really important in a few minutes. But one of the reasons why I was hired was because of a program called Abilities at Work, and it was started by my supervisor, whose name is Caitlin Howarth, and she approached the Disability Resources and Services Office, who at that time was run by Aaron Spector, and she said basically said we need to help more people on the spectrum gain employment, because as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, that the employment and underemployment rates for those of us on the spectrum are significantly lower than compared to the rest of the population. So this program was created, and I was hired through it, and it was by far the greatest blessing that I had in college, because it's not just on campus employment and gaining work experience. It's interacting with people, with coworkers that otherwise you wouldn't interact with. I had no intention of applying for this job until Aaron contacted me about Abilities at Work. So yeah, it was like I said, it was a blessing, and I worked at the information desk. And those of you who know Temple's campus would know that the north entrance of the Student Center, everyone goes through there during normal circumstances. So literally, I saw everyone that was enrolled in classes between fall 2016 and spring 2019, and it was a godsend, because it made me realize, more so than the student government, which I was a part of for most of my 4 years, that I could make a difference, and that I could make a positive impact, not only in my life but in other people's lives, including and especially my coworkers. So moving on to another experience that kind of had an opposite effect on me. That was the Defense Logistics Agency, and it's a branch of the Department of Defense, and they just happen to have a location not far from where I'm located in Northeast Philadelphia. So I should note too that I was able to obtain this job, even though it's not on the slide, through a program similar to Abilities at Work called the Federal Workforce Recruitment Program. And it's a broader program for federal employees with disabilities to gain employment. So it sounded intriguing to me, and it wasn't like the work environment was awful. My coworkers were great, and I really got along with the people, the other interns that were hired through the WRP, as they call it. But I just realized that, like, if any of you know the federal government, you know that it takes a lot of time to gain access to systems. So what I mean by that is, like, systems that you need in order to perform your job to the best of your ability. And I wasn't able to do that a lot of the time until it was time to go back to school. So so for that reason, and for many others, I just learned that it wasn't a great fit for me. One important thing to know about that job was I was in an office, and again, I was close to home with people that reminded me of, like, being at home. So which isn't to say that being at home which isn't to say, like, I went to Temple because, like, I wanted to expand my horizons, and to me, going to a place like this did not expand my horizons. So I have here that I wanted to sing more in the community rather than remain silent in a cubicle. And I mentioned earlier that I sing, but I sang during my early intervention years before I could talk, and I also displayed, like, I communicated through, like, blocks and toys and things, because back then they didn't have, like, iPads yet. So yeah. So I also realized that it wasn't just true for communicating in general, it was also true for my career. And that's why I found this CAPS training to be so intriguing, but not at first. So as a part of the first cohort to graduate in June of 2019, and I nearly didn't take part. Keep in mind that back when I was in college, I was a history major, so I wasn't quite sure where this would fit in. So so I emailed back and forth with Katie Kaplan of CBH, and she made me realize that this was an important thing, and I decided to do it. But I didn't actually come to that realization until I did the training. So um, so like it wasn't just for a professional in a professional sense, like that this was a professional training. Rather, it was also a training for self-reflection and how autism could fit in my future. And this is something I've been thinking about for a number of years now, but all autism has always been a part of me. But like and I wanted to make autism from the time I was in high school a part of my career as well. It's just up until this point, I hadn't quite been exposed to as many people on the spectrum as I had been at that training. And one thing I realized in that training was autism is beautiful. You often hear that a lot in like Black culture, like Black is beautiful, or like being gay is beautiful, or transgender. But when I reflected on this, the different traits that make us if you've met one person on the spectrum, you've only met one person on the spectrum. The different traits that make that statement true are what make autism beautiful. And that is when that's when I realized this is the point in my life I realized that. And the training also made me realize the kind of impact I wanted to make, and it was similar to the mission of CAPS. So so I graduated, and then I graduated from CAPS, and it came at a convenient time because a month earlier I received my diploma from Temple. So I applied for the role at Mental Health Partnerships, and then I received during my interview, or when I was going into the office at MHP, I received this email from Katie Kaplan, and it was about being a part of a research team at Temple University for travel training, and it immediately caught my interest. And at this time, I still didn't have a job other than the hours I was working with the student center, which is why the student center was helpful, because I was still looking for a job. So, but at this time, it just happened to come at a time when my dad was on vacation, and we were staying at my my mobile home down at the Jersey Shore. So the reason I bring that up is if it hadn't taken 2 hours to drive down there, I would have applied as soon as I got home to Philly. So, but as soon as I got back, I did apply, and during my last week at the student center, I had my interview. And just to not confuse people with the timeline, the following week, I was notified that I didn't get the MHP full-time position, like some of the other CAPS graduates had done. And I was depressed because I thought it would take a long time for me to hear something, again. But then I received a call a couple weeks, about a week and a half later, I want to say it was, later, from Amber Davidson, who is a research coordinator for this research team, and she asked me to be a peer interventionist on the FIP transportation study they were working on, and yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about the participants. So the participants met between September 2019 and October 2020, with a focus between with a pause between March and August 2020, and we'll get into the pause in just a moment. But we saw 4 participants prior to the pandemic. We saw 4 participants in a group. and they're the reason why I love this job. And again, there's a reasons that I'll get into in just a moment. But the thing about these participants is they were spread out prior to the pandemic all over the region to places I had never been before. But they also took me places that a lot of people would enjoy, including Amber from Temple. I'm sure she'll appreciate this. That's me last year in front of Lincoln Financial Field. We took a participant who was interested in the Eagles there. So yeah. But the frustrating thing about it was a part-time job. I still had to obtain full-time status, and that is where community behavioral health came into the picture, or CBH. A team at CBH was basically interested in my services, and in mid to late February was when the contract was finally, or actually the month before that, in January, that's when a contract that was being worked on between the primary investigator from the Temple study, whose name is Dr. Beth Pfeiffer, and a team at CBH, we were able to finalize this contract, and I was able to become full-time because of community behavioral health. So I'll talk a little bit about what I did. And this slide right here is intentionally short because the content on this slide is just 3 weeks long. So I attended provider meetings, and that's what I did. That's actually what I did, or no, the Philly AP work group is what I did on my first day, and that is like a night and day change from what happened at DLA, because I was in the room right away. With DLA, it took a while, if you might remember, but with the Philly AP work group, I was in the room right away with some of the most important people in the Philly Autism Project, some of the people that you've heard from throughout this conference. And it was a great honor to be sitting in the room with them when I just found out about the organization probably like 2 or 3 years before that. So it was quite a turnaround. And I was also added to the Family Navigator Steering Committee, for those of you who are part of that and know what that is. So, and I also attended a few provider meetings. That's really the extent of what I did with CBH, because COVID hit 3 weeks after I started. So, and the role really changed a lot in that time. And I'll talk a little bit about how. So one of the responsibilities that CBH was going to give me before the pandemic hit was to look up different events, look for ways to promote the autism community within the team at CBH, and like events. And what I mean by events is events such as like the Philly, the Eagles Autism Challenge and things like that. Like if we had like a vendor table or something like that, and at the to be more present in the community, to be more present in the community that we serve, if that makes sense. So yeah, but COVID hit, and that changed a lot of things, obviously. All the responsibilities that I talked about earlier moved to an online format, and some of those responsibilities took longer to restart than others. And by the way, I should make note that there's no timetable for a potential return to 801 Market. And so my supervisor at CBH, whose name is Cynthia Dutwin, and I tried to come up with an alternative activity, and we came up with the News Blast. The News Blast basically serves the purpose of what we were going to do before, and keeps our team aware of certain events in the autism community from the perspective of an autistic in the autism community. So, and it's really been a success. We've created 3 editions so far with the News Blast. I think time's running low, or I would go into some of our future stories that we've done. But I just want to mention that in the next edition that we're planning, I plan on having our conference as someone that has attended all of the sessions. As someone that has attended all the sessions, that the conference will be the featured in the next edition. And real quick, this is the an example of what the news blast looks like, with the cover story right here. And the cover story in the last news blast was about our restart. So, as I mentioned, our study was paused between March 12th and August 24th due to the coronavirus restrictions. And when I first heard about this, it was the day that 801 Market was last open to us, last open to the employees, because there had been an exposure earlier that day, and we had to get rid of all of our things, and so that the building could do a deep cleaning. So I was coming home from doing that, and then I received a call from Amber saying that because where she lives in Montgomery County is having a stay-at-home order, we were going to pause our study. And I really felt like, uncomfortable with that, because we were about to go from being all over the region to not being anywhere. So it took a toll on me, and I felt like that our services are needed. So that's why I said we need to really consider restarting. And the advisory board thought long and hard about it, and they basically advise us on what is going on, like best practices and things. So they thought about it, and we ultimately decided to restart in August. So I'll go through a couple quick stories. So in Norristown, we met with a participant in Norristown, and we took the bus to Chick-fil-A, where his girlfriend, or soon-to-be girlfriend, was working, and he was just so grateful. Keep in mind, like, he lives in giant Montgomery County, and he would bike from Pottstown, from his house to Pottstown, from his house to this location, and it was just like, he said that, I'll never forget this day when we were able to meet his soon-to-be girlfriend. So, and that's really when I started to realize that this what we're doing here is making an impact and is changing lives. So he went from riding bicycles everywhere to using public transportation to get to where he needed to go. So another story I have is a participant in Doylestown. We would go to Center City with him after practicing transportation near his area, and then but I mean, coming from Doylestown, it takes an hour and a half to take the train to Center City, and that took it obviously is a long time. So yeah. So we decided to meet at a location near his house, and we talked about everything. We talked about, like, we didn't necessarily talk about transportation all the time. We talked about a lot of things, and again, that's another thing that made me realize the kind of impact that this is having. So, and then I'll get to story 3. This participant in Northeast Philly, actually very close to my location, is into swords, and he's a talker. So, what would happen if we went to a place called Battle Sword, in which they do a bunch of sword fighting, and they have, like, practice matches and things like that. So we took him to Battle Sword, and you could tell he was just so grateful. This person was in isolation, and he wanted to explore the community a little bit more, and he was just amazed that public transportation could get him there by himself. So I'm incredibly honored to have been a part of all 3 of those stories, plus many more that I didn't get to share. But I'll just end with something to think about for everybody. I want everyone to think about if they notice any differences between these three stories. Um, and while you think about that, and you can share your thoughts too in the chat, by the way. Um, I want to make the argument that there is no difference. What we saw in the participants as far as the progress that they made, it wasn't very much different between a pre-COVID time and the time we're living in now. But as you can see, all of these participants are wearing face coverings, and we distribute hand sanitizer to all of the participants as soon as they get off the L or the bus or whatever we happen to be taking that day. So, but the gratitude they have, the connection that they have with the community, it's just something it strikes me as so important. And it leads me to think, like, we're living in a time right now that, like, people are not as comfortable with going out and doing things like this as they were before. But I want to make the argument that it is still worth it. That these I want to put out a disclaimer. Travel training people that are taking the bus and the trolley and the L or whatever they're taking is much more challenging when I'm doing it from here, and it's next to impossible. So we figured we needed to do it in person. But I want to say that these in-person services are still so important. And I mean, like, and I think we need to be less afraid of helping people that really need help like this. We need to make sure that they are in fact receiving the help that they would like to have. So okay. So I think that's all I have. Now I'll be able to take some of your questions.